Do you have a friend who's excited to play the most broken aurabot ascendancy yet? Do you not want to be a Totem armor stacking meta abuser? And allow me to introduce you to possibly the dumbest build you'll ever see. Back in 321, myself and a buddy created a build using the infamous exploding totems in order to do uber boss carries with a full 6-man party scaling. Now, coming into Legacy of Phrecia, we're planning to do the exact same thing with this build. This is more of a proof of concept and theory crafting of this sort of build, so we're not going to go into every little bit in detail too much, but just so people can get more eyes on it, this is what we're planning to do. First, I just want to show off what this build can do like day 1, day 2 with like very little money and that sort of thing. So you can see on the side here, each individual totem does about 3.6 for a total of about 18 million damage. This has basically 0 uniques, no flasks are on, there's no like weird config shenanigans. The only thing that's configured really is making chill appear and getting max chill with Divine Ire with its large hits is relatively normal. There's a convert mod because I'm too lazy to write convert on my gloves, but that's a little bit easy to get. We have a mediocre shock. It's not even going to full at 50% shock value. And you can see that we're still doing almost 20 million DPS. This skyrockets tremendously if you start adding like Heat Shiver, which adds like another 20%-ish damage. If you start using Flask, you get more damage. We're even missing a jewel socket because I'm currently using a jewel socket to put the like Ascendancy jewel in here, and you can see there's only level 94 points in here. You can see the tree is like relatively whatever. There's like one basic cluster, mostly because I just want to get access to Sleep of Centuries for free onslaught and that sort of thing. And yeah, this is a life base, like before you have the commit to ES with your aurabot. As for the skill gems here, you can see this is like the primary link. We're also running Herald of Purity up here as well on Arrogance. We're doing some fancy, you can run Arrogance stuff with Petrified Blood if you want. It will enable you to run Pain Attunement here for extra damage, because you'll have a pretty healthy buffer of energy shield from your support. So you can do that if you want to. Otherwise, if you don't want to do Petrified Blood stuff, you can drop Petrified Blood and just run Herald of Purity on mana. Automation for just a thing, you can make this cast with damage taken as well. There's an Assassin's Arcanist brand for a curse, and then currently, we are self-casting Elemental Weakness. The reason for that is that you can eventually get an upgrade for Balance of Terror, which you can see here, which is when you manually cast a Balance of Terror, you just get a chunk of Fizz as extra random element, which as you can see is worth a reasonable amount of damage. So that is the reason why this is self-cast currently. But at this point, when you don't have that jewel, you could put it in the Arcanist brand instead. We have some basic stuff like Skitterbots with Bone Chill. These aren't really necessary because you're probably going to be applying it yourself. So if you want to swap these out for something else that your aurabot can't handle yet, go ahead. And then just basic mobility. The main damage skill is, you'll note that we are not using a Soul Mantle yet. So we have to manually use Spell Totem in this link. And that is accounted for. There's 6 links here, including Spell Totem. You do a Spell Totem, Multi-Totem. You can swap Concentrated Effect for increased AoE if you're trying to do mapping. Hypothermia is just overall good for if you have a chill. Physical to Lightning is used in the early game to do the other half of conversion here. So you can see the Divine Ire has a baseline 50%. Physical to Lightning does the other 50%. In the long term, you're going to want to get a glove with the implicit that converts Fizz to Lightning, as well as the crafted mod from, I don't remember who's veiled, Elrion's veiled, maybe? I don't know exactly anymore. But there's a specific veiled mod that you can craft onto gloves, which gives it another 25%. And that's how that's how you'll get rid of Fizz to Lightning in the late game. And you'll also note that I'm using Divine Ire disintegration. This is because this is like the single target version. You will not want to use this on mapping. If you want to use it, if you want to map with this build, for example, if you're still doing Atlas stuff in the early game, you can run normal Divine Ire. I have this set up here with 2 Divine Ires just to like emulate both the channeling DPS and the release DPS because they are both important. And you can see that we only drop about 4 mil DPS, so about 20% damage to trade off for like relatively decent mapping speed or like a relatively decent mapping skill. Next, I want to go into the endgame version of the build, which is where you saw the huge 2 billion DPS number on the start. This is basically a version of the build where we aimed for roughly 2 billion. We could, in theory, get substantially more. There's extra points here for level 100 because we are spending 3 points up here to get like the ascendancy emulation stuff. So just bear in mind that you don't actually have these 3 points. This is just to get the ascendancy values. So that's realistically, this is a level 100 tree. You'll see that our survivability, like max hits are pretty good, except Fizz, which is like kind of mediocre. The same cluster jewel setup is here. You could probably optimize that. We didn't bother. Fizz looked like the best jewel, and there's not a ton of medium clusters that we cared about. You'll see that we have tattoos for energy shield basically everywhere. This is just because it was the most efficient thing to do here, realistically. You can also tattoo lightning damage on these as well if you want damage instead of HP, but you don't really get that much damage per those, and this you get HP, and because we're doing tranquility, we're also getting a teeny bit of damage out of each of these, like 0.1 DPS per tattoo. But you can see that in this build, we're also basically fully kitted up with uniques. We're using a lot of uniques and a lot of very expensive uniques in this setup. First off is Annihilating Light. This requires a little bit of work from your aurabot, because getting Annihilating Light working is basically a pain in the ass unless you have an aurabot running crazy purities and purity of elements, and also linking you elemental res through a bismuth flask with the Paladin ascendancy node. The node that allows them to share flasks with you. At that point, you will almost slightly, barely, you can say have a little bit of excess, but you'll be able to push up and over and still have 90 res. And that's like probably one of the biggest upgrades, because if you compare it to, for example, to Nebulous, you can see that we lose quite a bit of damage. We go down to 1.4 bill versus the 2 bill that Annihilating Light is. These aren't perfect. Nebulous is, of course, you can have way better implicits, but I don't think it will ever come close to Annihilating Light in terms of like actual raw damage output, as long as you can get the resistance to sustain it. Because of course, we're trying to live here, which is why we have so much ES and not sacrificing it all for damage. And this POB, we're also turning on our flasks to kind of better emulate. You'll see that basically the only rare we have left is our gloves. And that is because this is where it's not on this item currently, but this is where you're going to put the rest of your cold conversion or lightning conversion. This is where you're going to get that. And then we just have a random belt here because the belt slot's kind of dead. Traditionally, Fizz Totem builds on Hyro would run Arn's Anguish. But because we don't have the Hyro node for 4 min endurance charges, we don't get the 4 min brutal charges, so it's just not worth using. And you can see we have a bunch of uniques here. So we have Heat Shiver, we have Soul Mantle, which has an interesting interaction, which we'll go into after with the new Paladin Ascendancy. We have Ralakesh because it's just good damage even if you don't have a ton of charges. Replica Dragon's Fang on Divine Ire. This actually isn't the best amulet you can get. There's actually a better amulet you can get with +1 Fizz, +1 all spell combined with like other good damage mods, but that is like absurdly expensive, and I don't know if I'm ever going to get my hands on it before the league ends. We have a Taming because it ended up being more DPS than just running like a double damage mod, Circle of Guilt. We also have an Anathema so that we can run 3 curses, or all of our curses that we need. So that would be Elemental Weakness, Frostbite, Assassin's Mark, and Punishment. Those are basically the 4 useful ones because we're fully cold converted. And that about sums it up for unique gear. Now then we move into unique jewels. There's quite a lot of those as well. We are currently Flesh Flaming Explosive Expert, because if you look over at Explosive Expert, because we're actually going to be applying all 3 types of ailments, because we have Shock from the Ascendancy, we have Chill and Freeze from the Ascendancy, or not from being cold damage in general already. And then we also have Ignite from Heat Shiver, because we're going to be critting most of the time, so we'll probably have an Ignite on them most of the time as well. And Explosive Expert applies a bunch of crit multi, a bunch of crit, and Ellie Pen based on which ailment, and we have all 3. Some other good runner-ups are Polymath for just good damage and like decent sustain, and there's some other good ones in here. I believe some of these are, this is a +1 power charge if you're doing power charge stacking. This one's not bad this one's pretty good if you're not capped crit, though you'll probably find that the crit here is way overkill. This is pretty good if you're doing strictly bossing because it gives you just 25% more damage. And this is like okay as well because it gives you Cull if you don't have Cull like on a support ability or an aurabot ability. But otherwise, the other unique gems, we have the Ascendancy gem, of course, and then Watcher's Eye is just a double hatred. This can be basically any 2 beneficial mods. This is a really, really good Watcher's Eye with flat crit and cold res. It basically gets our crit up to where it is, because if we remove this, you can see that we actually lose a ton of crit chance there. So that's why we have the flat crit mod, but you can get crit elsewhere if you want, and then just not run that mod. We have the Balance of Terror that we mentioned earlier, which just gives the Fizz as a random element if you've manually casted Elemental Weakness previously. We have a Militant Faith, which you can use to grab Inner Conviction, which basically just gives you a ton of power charges. Going past that, we have the Other Flesh, and then we have a Light of Meaning, which if you want damage, you can turn this into basically any of the damage types that we care about for scaling, which is like, I think, Fizz, Lightning, and Cold. Or if you want defensiveness, you can run 3% energy shield like I am here currently. Lastly, I want to highlight an important interaction that really helps this build in the end game, which is involving Soul Mantle. So traditionally, you may have noticed it if you're the keen-eyed and you've played this unique before, is that Soul Mantle inflicts a curse on you when your totems die. This also includes when you despawn your totems from overcasting them. So generally the downside of this means you need to find a way to get complete curse mitigation, whether that's through Kikazadu's, now Jewel mods, Viridi's Veil, those sort of things, Aziri's Reflection as well. However, there's one very interesting mod that allows you to get this very quickly and make use of Soul Mantle relatively quickly as long as your aurabot is on top of it, and that is a Paladin mod at the top here called Absolution. This mod up here, the one at the very top, says curses inflicted on you instead of linked targets. This does work with Soul Mantle curses. This means that you as the carry don't have to sacrifice your gear that you could be using for survivability or, more importantly, damage, particularly in the early game, to get curse immunity. Your aurabot, which generally has a lot more leniency in their sort of gearing and stuff like that, can just simply run a curse immune setup instead, whether that's Aziri's Reflection or Viridi's Veil or gem mods. It's just you no longer have to handle the curse immunity as long as your aurabot is linked to you, and that is very good for enabling Soul Mantle early and getting an extra support gem basically for free. I also just want to mention, I do have a leveling POB. It is a little bit rough and not exactly great. It has no notes, but it does have skill breakdowns that I'm planning to do between each act, and also from Act 4 onwards. I have leveling trees that I'm planning to follow personally, but again, I don't guarantee that this is going to work. There might be adjustments on the fly at the time, because it is a little bit awkward to play a totem build where you don't have access to Ancestral Bond until Act 4-ish, unless you go straight for it and ruin all of your damage. So just keep that in mind. You can follow it if you like. You are also recommended to follow your own favorite leveling skill if you want. This is just my interpretation. If you don't have anything, feel free to follow. Hope you enjoyed the concept, and just as a reminder, this is a proof of concept and a theory craft. It is not necessarily guaranteed to work. I've done a build like this in the past with my aurabot duo, but it's not guaranteed to still be working because totems have been nerfed substantially since. The POB seems to reinforce the idea, but just keep that in mind. And also remember, this is designed for boss carrying primarily, although you can do it in mapping using the normal Divine Ire. It's not designed for that, and it will be objectively weaker than a lot of different sort of builds like Spark or the armor stacking. And also as a reminder, the armor stacking build is just going to be stronger. It scales way harder, and it just does insane amounts of damage at the high end. So just keep that in mind. This isn't the best build, but it's going to be a fun build. I'm going to love it. I'm going to blow up some bosses with it, and I hope you do too.